One of our speakers was to be John Gronberg today. He's the head of the Holland Harbor Historic Lighthouse Commission, and was going to answer some questions you may have on some of the current litigation that's going on. But our speaker is also well versed in that and will answer any questions for you as well. Valerie VanHeest is an award-winning museum exhibit designer, historian, and author whose personal mission is to entertain people while educating and inspiring them. She grew up in the north side of Chicago and had a Bachelor of Arts degree from Loyola University in an architectural field and works as a project manager. She is an award-winning museum exhibit designer, historian, and author. And she gave a talk earlier this summer, which many of us saw on shipwrecks, on the ethic of the Lady Elgin. And that was a very interesting talk, and has given talks in the past. So we welcome her back again today. Through her firm, Valerie VanHeest and Associates, Valerie curates and designs museum exhibits. The Historical Society of Michigan honored her with a State History Award in 2007 for her efforts in preserving and promoting Michigan's maritime history, as well as presenting awards for 2 of her books. In 2017, the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History recognized her for 30 years of work with the Joyce C. Hayward Award for Historical Interpretation. Valerie is an underwater explorer who's been involved in the discovery and archaeological documentation of numerous historic Great Lakes shipwrecks. Combining her passion for maritime history and her professional writing and design experience, Valerie shares her ventures through award-winning books, films, lectures, and museum exhibits. She is an inductee into the Women's Divers Hall of Fame and a recipient of the Michigan State History Award for her work in preserving and promoting the state's submerged maritime history. She has written a number of books. The most recent just made it onto the shelves of the stores downtown here, and has had numerous magazine articles. She's a regular presenter at museums, libraries, and film festivals, and she shares the dramatic stories of mysteries on the Great Lakes. And she has been on television and news networks, and has also appeared on National Geographic, History, and Travel channels. Since 2001, she has served as director of the nonprofit Michigan Shipwreck Research Association and spearheading the search for and documentation of lost ships. Valerie, we welcome you back to Heest again today, to our crowd here and on Zoom, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Wow. That made me tired listening to all that. I was there for all of it. It's been a long time. Shipwrecks are what most of you have seen me talk about before. And I guess I could say my life has been a bunch of shipwrecks, and that's a good thing. But shipwrecks and lighthouses do tend to go hand in hand. The lighthouses are meant to prevent shipwrecks from happening. So I backed into this particular topic rather in an unexpected way. And let me share with you that. As Lauren mentioned, I'm a museum exhibit designer. I transitioned from being an architectural designer to focusing on curating and designing museum exhibits. And the Pump House Museum, operated by the Historic Ottawa Beach Society, has been my client for a number of years. And about 5 years ago, they challenged me to develop an exhibit about Big Red Lighthouse. And I have to tell you, I wasn't really very excited about that topic. I thought, we know everything about the lighthouse. It's our lighthouse. And there's historical markers down at the lake that tell us the history. And what more could I generate that would be of interest to people that would fill a gallery the size of this classroom? And so I was a bit underwhelmed by the topic I had been given. I started my research with a visit to the historical marker, and you know that there's one on the south side and one on the north side at the beach. And each historical marker like these has a double side. So one side talks about the development of the Holland Harbor and the other talks about the development of the lighthouse. And so I started there, and I noticed that on the right, you'll see it says our structure lighthouse was erected, the first one in 1872. So that was a starting point for my research. Now, I also turned to a website that lighthouse historian Terry Pepper used to manage, and he was known as a lighthouse historian around all the Great Lakes. And I must say, I don't usually use secondary sources like a website. I usually use only primary sources when I'm researching a topic, but I started, second start here. And I noticed that Terry indicated that the first light had been erected in 1870. So I had a mystery on my hands. Which date is correct? So now it was getting a little juicy for me. So I started looking at a variety of sources. National Archives had a lot of information. Of course, newspapers had a lot of information, but you all know we had a fire here, and that eliminated some of our earlier newspaper records. So it was a bit of a challenge. But after getting through the research, I went back to visit those markers, and I found more than just one error. Found an error about the harbor and about the lighthouse date and about the range light date and when the fog signal building was erected and the name Big Red. I found all those errors, and it's carved in metal. There shouldn't be errors in metal signs. But all of that fed the information to create this exhibit at the Pump House Museum. Did anybody see that when it was running? It ran for 2 years. Okay, a few of you, more of you got to get down to the Pump House Museum. We redo the main gallery exhibits about every 2 or 3 years. So there's always something new there. But that exhibit opened, we had a lot of visitors, and let me share with you some of what came out of our understanding doing that exhibit, and then what has been put into the book. And of course, we have to start with the development of our harbor, and we can't start any story in Holland without talking about this fella, Albertus van Raalte. And as you all know, he led a group of Dutch immigrants to come to America to start a new life. And you all probably know the story. I won't belabor it. He and his party were originally headed to Wisconsin, but they came in winter, and transportation there, which would only be, this is a great map because it shows you the limitations of the railroad back in the day. This is an 1847 map. And so they couldn't take a steamship up Lake Huron, down Lake Michigan to get to where they were intended. So when they were wintering in the Detroit and the Lansing area, Judge Kellogg was sort of an advocate for settlement in Michigan. And so he convinced Van Raalte to take a look at 3 parcels of land where he might settle. And you see the circles there at the approximate locations. And ultimately, Van Raalte chose the Black Lake area, Black River, Black Lake. And that was the original name for what we're now calling Lake Macatawa. But obviously, he chose this area because it was very similar climate and conditions as they had in the Netherlands, a very wet, very, access to the water. And so that's where he chose to develop the colony. And at the time that the colonists came to Holland, 1847, and they started to think about a harbor, and Van Raalte appealed to Congress to survey the outlet from Black Lake into Lake Michigan. And this is a wonderful illustration of the survey drawing done by government surveyors that show the original curved outlet to the lake that made it very difficult to navigate. And the government thought of two potential access points. You see the small one in the middle and then the larger one on the right. There's a lot of homeowners today that are glad they didn't do it on the far right. But this was the proposed survey plan to make access better for Holland. Now, ultimately, the government chose the longer access. I'm not sure why. It went through the two hills, and they started doing work in the 1850s on that, but government funding was halted. And ultimately, you know that the Dutch, I'm sure you've all heard the story, the inventive Dutch weren't going to wait for the government. They got their shovels. They brought on an expert that was used to building dams in the Netherlands, and they dug a channel by hand. The illustration in the upper right corner was done for a newspaper campaign in the 1950s to illustrate that the Dutch created a little shack out there to live in, and they started digging the channel. And indeed, it worked as they had hoped. It opened up direct access, and then that built up land on the other side. And you can see what was left of the original access became a little inland lake then when it was closed up to open the channel. So that really changed the contours of the property out there. Well, by 1865, ships were coming regularly into Holland. And as you all know, it's about 7 miles down the length of the lake. And think about it, we're the only town along the west shore of Lake Michigan that's settled inland, far inland. All the others are settled much closer to the lake. So we had, quite a channel or quite a challenge to bring those ships that length to the city. And they were delivering goods to the city. They were taking out finished goods. They were bringing in more immigrants. So this was a hustle and bustling community at the time. And because there was so much traffic and new settlers, and the colony was growing into a city, Van Raalte appealed to Congress for a navigational aid to protect those shipping interests coming into our city. And this is a wonderful plat map. I believe this is from about the 1870s. And you see, they didn't correct. It took a long time to correct these plat maps. So you see that near the lake is government property. I don't know if this will work, but you see beneath the curved access that the government had purchased all of that property to do the developing of the channel out there. And by 1870, the government, you see the little American flag there, the government decided to take a chunk of land that they already owned and parcel that out for the development of the first navigational aid. And that was considered a beacon light, not a lighthouse. It was a wooden structure. This is one of the documents that I found in the National Archives collection. And we see a date there, upper left corner, established 1870. So that's what confirmed what the historian Terry Pepper had said about the origins of Holland's first navigational aid. We have a really beautiful close-up photograph. This is not from 1870, it's much later, but it gives us a sense of what that structure was. A white painted wooden beacon, about 34 feet high. It had on top a lantern. That's what the octagonal shape on top is called. And in the center of that lantern, you can see a 5th order Fresnel lens. I'll talk a little bit more about lenses later, but the Fresnel lens made with a series of glass prisms was able to refract the light out farther than just a single flame. And of course, it was kerosene lit. There was no electricity back in the day. This was a pretty standard beacon structure. There's quite a few cities that had a structure like this. So it was very ordinary compared to what we have today. Now, the original keeper that was hired, and documents also tell us that Melgert van Regenmoorder was hired to be the first keeper, and he started his position at Holland in 1870. So that's another confirmation that the first light went up there. So he had to provide his own quarters for living, and there is no record where he lived. I assume he built some sort of a structure out in what is Macatawa Park today so that he could live near the lighthouse. But the government had to find the money, find the staff to get out there and build a keeper's house. And that didn't happen until 1874. So Van Regenmoorder had his own quarters for 4 years. But this is the first keeper's house that he had to live in. You can look at the floor plan, a very simple structure. And I think one of the rooms said, yeah, oil room, bottom right-hand corner. So isn't that safe? They're storing oil where he's living. I don't think OSHA had any requirements back then. Right next to the kitchen with the wood burning stove. Yeah, very good. So the keeper's house on the left, you can see that juxtaposition, two different photographs to the beacon light on the right. And that was about 500 feet distant. So he had a 500-foot walk to work every morning. And very key to his job was, each lighthouse keeper had a litany of things that they were responsible for, but the ultimate responsibility was keeping the light lit. And so that meant refilling the oil in that lantern regularly. And you can see what a chore that would have been. Now, that's the existence out there for many years, almost a decade, when Van Raalte was alone with his wife, his children, no other people living in that area. So it must have been a very lonely existence. What he did see on occasion are campers, because that being government property out there, and also government property on the opposite side of the channel, dare I say, where Holland State Park is today. But those are very desolate areas. They were all owned by the government. And so people made their way to camp out there. And that was before there was a fee to camp in a state park. It was just very unofficial. But of course, back in the day, that was the only way to get away from the heat of the city and enjoy the cool breezes of the Lake Michigan shoreline. So the lakeshore became very popular. And this man, John, oh boy, I'm going to forget his name, Roost, I believe. He traveling through that channel, if anybody knows, I think I boo-booed his name, but if anybody do you recognize his picture from Facebook? No. He was traveling through the channel and saw the campers and realized, boy, this would be a great place to erect cottages. And so he was able to put together a group of businessmen and purchase the remainder of the land from the government. And they already had their beacon light, their keeper's house. They weren't in need of anything else. So that land was sold to develop a new cottage park. And so that brought about another very changing landscape out there, and also future consequences for our future lighthouse. So the Macatawa Park Association was founded by this fella. I know his name is John Post, I believe. And founded in 1882. And let me just mention, I've done a lot of research on the West Michigan Park Association at Ottawa Beach. That was founded 3 years later. Those people largely from Grand Rapids wanted the land that Macatawa Park originally purchased. They couldn't have that land, and so they settled for the other side of the lake. But the story of our lighthouse is really very commingled with the story of Macatawa Park. So I'm going to weave those two together. In Macatawa Park, 1882, the year that the park was established, and these parks were not uncommon. Along the shores of West Michigan, there were a number of cottage parks established, and all of those cottage parks started with a hotel because even the people that were part of the original founding, they didn't have a place to live until they could build their cottages. So the original hotel was called the Park House Hotel, very simple, very primitive structure out there, but great for the individuals that bought into the cottage park, hundreds of lots. And across the way, many of you have already seen information on the kiosk that I developed on the north side of the lake about the Hotel Ottawa, and that structure was developed over there. So now we've got two cottage parks in development that are bringing a lot of people out there. And you can see this illustration from a promotional brochure from the late 1880s that this is starting to be, a popular place out there. You see nestled between the hills, the main hotel out at Macatawa Park. And there's Holland still in the distance, 7 miles. Well, steamships, largely from Chicago, but from other areas as well, would deliver the vacationers, and vacationing was a brand new concept in the 1880s. So steamships would come through our channel, guided by the beacon light, deliver passengers to Black Lake. And other commercial traffic was coming through the lit channel as well. And we know that wherever there's traffic, there's tragedies. And there were a couple of early incidents. This is the HC Peru, and the other one is the Kate Lyons, a steamer on the left, a schooner on the right that met with disaster at the channel. Now, the good thing is the disasters didn't involve any loss of life, but both of these ships were complete losses. So they just broke up in time near our channel. And because of those losses and some others that I'm not going to go into here, the government recognized that Holland was starting to be a very busy port. And so they decided to erect a life-saving service station. And these were cropping up around the Great Lakes. Grand Haven had gotten one before us. Up near Ludington, they'd gotten a life-saving station because there was a lot of lumbering going on up there, but we got our station in 1886. And at that point, the government had to appeal to the cottage park to acquire a third parcel of adjacent land, because by then they had already sold off all the government land. So now they had 3 parcels, and the life-saving service station was built east of the keeper's home. So that was quite a little government installation out there. This photograph is part of the Horner collection. The Holland Museum has the collection. The Pump House Museum, the Joint Archives now has the collection. It actually came through John Gronberg's wife, Bonnie, who was related to the Horner family. And I say all that because this is an early picture. This is probably from the 1890s, based on the fact that there are a number of cottages along the lakeshore built there. We see the original beacon light. We also see a catwalk that was erected soon after the light so that Melgert van Regenmoorder, the keeper, could get out there to keep that light lit even when the waves were crashing over the pier. And over the years, the piers kept being extended farther out into the lake to try to make them safer to enter that channel. But this Horner collection gives us a wonderful source of images over the decades, the early decades of the cottage park development there, that give us a view that we normally don't see. So appreciate these images. There's an image of the life-saving station and Melgert van Regenmoorder in his later years, probably the 1890s at that point. You might recognize that name because he is an ancestor of the Senator van Regenmoorder. And the life-saving service and Van Regenmoorder were very joined at the hip. Van Regenmoorder had a closer, with his position at the light, he could see any ships approaching. He could see if there were any ships in danger. So there was a great communication between the two entities, both government entities. Now, by 1890, Macatawa Park had started to have a number of private cottages built. They already had the Park House Hotel. They were appealing not only to the people who owned property and cottages, but also other people that wanted to come out there for shorter visits. So in 1890, they parceled off a chunk of land within the park to develop a larger hotel complex. So in 1895, the association, the homeowners association, sold that chunk that I had highlighted in green to an independent company that was going to come in and develop the park for a larger use for day trippers or people coming for a weekend. And so the new Macatawa Park Hotel was erected in 1895. Very beautiful architecture, turn of the century architecture. The original Park House Hotel, you can see a hint of it on the left. It was turned into the dining facility for the hotel. So lots of development out there. The park company that came in that developed the new hotel, they also built a bathhouse around 1900. This is another photograph from the Horner collection, and take a look at that, single square structure. You'll see a picture of that later. They built a dock for receiving the steamship so people could have almost direct access to the park. There was also in later years, a railroad station built out there to bring people from inland. So this is getting to be a very busy place. You see on the right there is an association building where just vacationers that were spending the day out there could get food and sundries, and just like we have the general store on the north side today, we had a store out there. And you see the train station, the interurban was extended to run out there. So there's a close-up of that association building where various different shops were held. And so by 1901, both sides of our channel were very developed. This is another illustration from a marketing brochure that we're bringing people out there. You can see by 1901, the Hotel Ottawa had expanded to a much larger facility, and you see a lot more cottages, and the Macatawa Park Hotel, not really a good indicator. That hotel was much more to the right than you see in this illustration. But with all that activity, the government finally determined after more than 30 years in operation and with many storm-related damages to the light that we were in need of a new beacon light, taller, more sturdy. So by 1901, the government brought in a new steel beacon light. It's taller. This is a great photograph that I found on eBay. It's not in any of our historical archives, but it's fascinating because it tells us that the wooden tower was there, the pier was extended, the steel tower was erected near the end of the pier, and the lantern that held the Fresnel lens was moved to the top of the steel beacon. So they were repurposing, they weren't completely getting rid of it. And you see the very prominent Hotel Ottawa on the left and a few of the cottages on the right, but a great photograph. So there's the steel beacon light. When they put the beacon light in, they changed out the Fresnel lens from a 5th order to a 4th order. And the strange thing about the Fresnel lens, the order talks about the size. The bigger the number, the smaller the lens. So when we got a 4th order lens that was bigger, that lens, many of you will recognize, sits today in the Holland Museum. So it stands at about eye level. The prisms themselves are about 2 feet tall. But now with the increased height, because you all understand the curvature of the earth, so the taller the structure and the bigger the Fresnel lens, the light could travel farther out into the lake, making it a safer navigational aid for mariners. And what we also had erected at that time was a range light behind the beacon light. That would allow a mariner to line up the tall light with the lower light so that they could get a straight shot into the channel and avoid hitting one of the piers if they were coming in darkness or in bad conditions. The other structure on the left, that's a watchtower for the life-saving service so that they could keep an eye on the lake for any signs of trouble. Here's another photograph from the Horner collection, and I love the collection because they're just capturing everyday activities. This is obviously a photograph of the family's young child, but they happen to capture our beacon light at the same time. And, you know, think about today, we go down to the beach and we pose our family and friends in front of the light. So it's always been a backdrop, even in the early days before we had what we now know as Big Red. There's another image, you know, just a beautiful family image, and the light is the focal point of that image, as well as the dog, of course. But we had now a better light that could be seen from farther. But what about on days like today? A foggy day. Well, that was even more of a danger than trying to come into the channel at night. And so what Melgert van Regenmoorder did, industrious Dutch fellow that he was, he took a fish horn. These were horns that vendors that marketed fish would use. He got himself one of these, and whenever there was bad weather, he stood at the end of the pier blowing this. So, you know, what a dedicated guy. But, you know, Holland has always been, you know, sort of behind in getting government appropriations because it wasn't as busy a harbor as Chicago or Benton Harbor or Grand Haven. So he made do. But as he was making do, the government, the Lighthouse Board, the agency that was in charge of navigational aids, they started developing different concepts for how to create a navigational aid with sound. And so you see they parlayed that idea of the fish horn with let's talk about a really big horn. But you also see they were looking at railroad steam whistles. Railroads obviously generated steam to move the trains, and their whistles were proving to be pretty good. They were warning people at the crossroads that the train was coming. So why not warn mariners of land, essentially, you know, saying, here's land, don't hit me. So the government started experimenting, and in 1875, South Manitou Island had two different fog signal buildings built to test out equipment. And also down by Gary, Indiana, they had an early fog signal building. That whole building was required to house the steam equipment that would generate the sound from the whistle. So quite an undertaking to create that. So Holland started lobbying for a fog signal structure for our community. And so we were able to find again at the National Archives the documents that show us the plans for building a fog signal building next to the beacon light. And that's exactly what happened. And we see the design of this structure looking much the same as it does today. And I want to point out, there's the 10-inch steam whistle, this big.
Well, good
And look at
luck.
the size of that whistle highlighted on the left. And we needed that whole building to operate that whistle. Melgert van Regenmoorder wasn't very interested in running that steam equipment. So the dormers were for two other, I'll go backwards, dormers were for two other rooms. So assistant keepers could operate all that steam power equipment. Now, our historical marker down at the lake, it talked about that Big Red was designed in the Dutch style. And in fact, you know, leading us to believe that this was a unique structure designed for Holland. But prior to this, 1906, prior to our getting our fog signal building, this is Waukegan, Illinois. And you can see that's almost an identical structure. They had a different beacon light, so it was nestled next to their beacon light. But 2 years after our fog signal building was erected, Kewanee, Wisconsin, got a similar structure. So ours was not unique. Ours was not designed in the Dutch style. This was a turn of the century Queen Anne style structure. So that's the style of Big Red today. So now with a fog signal building and a beacon light, more and more traffic was coming into the harbor to bring people to those growing resorts. Each resort could handle about 1,000 guests at any one time. So 2,000 people could be staying out by the lake. Here's another photograph from the Horner collection, and we see, it's been wonderful to see in one family's collection the evolution of these 3 different navigational aids out there. So we see that the light was in front of the fog signal building, and you saw from that construction drawing that the piping ran through the steel beacon light and the whistle was located on the outside of the light. So they were really, sort of joined at the hip out there. This photograph I first saw long before I started studying Big Red. I first saw this photograph in the Boatworks restaurant. And so it's just a wonderful, it's probably our best close-up photograph where we can see those 2 structures together. And of course, you see the steam whistle on the outside of the light. Well, Melgert van Regenmoorder, as I said, had been serving for 37 years by the time the fog signal building had been erected. He didn't want to learn how to operate that equipment, so he decided to resign from his position. I think that's okay in his early 70s to have resigned, don't you think? He didn't need to be climbing that catwalk and all those stairs. Well, in 1907, other things were afoot in Macatawa Park, which you can see from this postcard is being, much more developed. A fellow who was an original homeowner there, his name was Swan. He decided to offer his services. He was in the real estate business in Chicago, and he decided to offer his services to help the Macatawa Park Association acquire back all the development that the Macatawa Park Company, these names are all very similar. Macatawa Park Association didn't like all that development out there. Their very private cottage resort was becoming very public. So this fellow Swan helped acquire that land back to run it for the association. But as it turns out, he continued to develop the park because obviously it was all about generating money. So you've all seen Angel's Flight, the incline railway that was developed out there. It was quite amazing. All along the water, when they ran out of land, they started building essentially boathouses on stilts over the water. You see a theater, there's some gift stores. Imagine this is Mackinac Island with all the gifty shops, in the water. So this Swan was really starting to develop this. And you remember that photograph of the beach house? Well, now that was developed. You see the balconies there. It was developed actually into guest rooms. So really bringing more and more people. And if you were a day tripper coming out on the interurban, you could also pay something like 50 cents to spend the day in the park, enjoy the beach, go gift shopping, ride the incline railways. So this was really a thriving community. Swan was also involved in establishing another hotel out there, the Grand Hotel, not the one on Mackinac Island. So it was a very busy place. And this illustration, while a little blurry, gives you a real sense of the development out there nestled between those 2 hills. Now, Swan, who had taken back that land in order to develop it with the association in mind, found a way. We think there might have been a little hanky-panky. He found a way to pull that away from the cottage owners and really develop it as a private endeavor. So the park out there has changed hands multiple times. Now, getting back to the lighthouse, you know that Melgert van Regenmoorder resigned. 1910 to 1912 is a period of change out there. The United States Lighthouse Board was morphed into the Lighthouse Service. With the government, we continue, we see it today, we saw it back then. Agencies are reformed, they're merged, all in the name of saving money and being more efficient. We've heard about some new efficiencies being proposed for the new administration. So it's something that has gone on throughout history. They tried a number of different keepers out there between Melgert leaving in 1907 and 1910 when Joseph Boschke took the position out there. The others didn't work out. Joseph did work out. He spent the last remaining years of the lighthouse service out there. And there were other changes afoot besides bringing on a new keeper. Finally, by 1932, we got electricity out there. And I say finally because I've done quite a bit of work on Ottawa Beach and the development of the hotel out there. And I know the pump house building stands in a 1901 electric power plant that was erected way back then. So why did it take the government fully 31 years after a hotel had electric lights to electrify the light? I cannot explain that one. I'm certain that Macatawa Park had electricity, but I haven't solved the mystery of why the government waited so long to electrify the light. But that electrification made for a lot of different changes in the name of efficiency and reducing maintenance. By 1936, the government realized that they could take down the steel beacon light because it was not needed. The steam power equipment that was inside the fog signal building was also not needed. So they could consolidate those two structures. So you see a tower being built in this 1936 photograph, and that's going to house a new lantern. We know that they got a new lantern because we see both of the lanterns in this photograph. They did reuse the same fourth order Fresnel lens, but we see the 1907 steel beacon light being loaded onto the government boat Hyacinth, a lighthouse tender. And we know from historical records that the steel beacon light was repurposed in the outskirts of Chicago on one of the piers that had been being built there. So the government was repurposing. But now we see a structure that's more in keeping with what we recognize today, except even though this is a black and white picture, I think we can all tell it's not painted red. It was originally painted a manila color. And at the time that the electrification happened, we got a brand, it was called a Cunningham triplex air horn. And so we needed very much smaller air tank storage inside the building than all the steam power equipment that was in there. And so we see that new horn erected on top of the new tower that housed the new lantern.
Through the microphone.
Now, 1939, another pivotal change. The government is consolidating. They're consolidating the lighthouse service with the original life-saving service to form the Coast Guard in 1939. Joseph Boschke, the keeper from 1910 on, he knew his time was limited. He was not of retirement age, but he realized that his position was going to be eliminated. He wasn't needed to keep the flame lit anymore. Now with a simple switch, they could turn on the lights. So he started preparing for an early retirement. And in fact, The life-saving station that had been erected in 1886, that was given a new name. It was the same station, but it was given a Coast Guard signage to repurpose that building. So more changing times. Life and the lighthouse are all about things changing. Nothing stays the same. From this photograph, we believe from the late 1940s, you can see that the fog signal building, the base, is still that manila color, but the tower is painted red. We understand that the Coast Guard was starting to morph into what would become government policy to have red on the right side of a channel. And for all you boaters, you know, the mantra is red, right, returning. So we start to see that happening before the whole structure was painted red. And this is a great photograph. And Dan Aument, he's on the board of the Historic Ottawa Beach Society. Somebody gave him this. It must be, you know, very early color photograph from the early 50s. So we finally get a glimpse of what the actual colors were. Great picture. But let's go back to Swan. Swan Miller, I believe is his name, if I'm remembering correctly. He had been operating for many, many years, the Macatawa Park Hotel. You remember the hotel was built in 1895. He took over in the 1910s. By the 1940s, he's still operating the park facility and all the common buildings out there. You see by now the railroad station, interurban station has been removed. We start to see cars out there. Automobiles really changed both of our hotels on either side of the channel because it was a new way of getting there. There was less steamship traffic bringing people in. And that's Swan Miller in his later years towards the 1845, same two people, hard to believe, but so he continued operating that facility out there all that time. But as he was nearing end of life, he started reaching out to consider a new owner out there. And this fella on the right, Simon Denial, he had a cottage out there and he decided to buy the hotel and all the associated buildings, common buildings for the resort. And so from 45 to 55, Simon Denial ran the Macatawa Hotel. Many of you probably were young'uns in the day and actually might have seen this out there. But you certainly saw the development because after the Macatawa Hotel was declared a fire hazard in 1955, they considered renovating, adding sprinklers, but the cost was just too much. And so in 1956, the whole resort was demolished. What a blow for that community, although the people who had cottages out there might have been a little happy about that. But now in 1956, that's when the Coast Guard decided to paint all structures on the right side of a channel when entering red. So that's when the color as we know it today was painted. Now, interestingly, the historical marker said that the community of Holland just started spontaneously calling it Big Red after the paint job. That is not true. And I'll tell you how it really did get named that in a little bit. Changes afoot in the 1960s, all in the name of efficiency. The Coast Guard no longer needed their station near the light. Now electricity could be operated remotely. It was not as efficient on that side. There were some access problems getting through the neighborhood for all the Coast Guard staff to come to the building. So they purchased property on the north side of Lake Macatawa where the channel stands today. And in the 1960s, Lady Bird Johnson was in charge of a program, the Beautification of America. And she and her crew did not think these two structures that had been long abandoned were very good looking. So they were both demolished in the 1960s. And this is not an actual aerial. This is a little Photoshop magic to just illustrate that with the passing of the Macatawa Hotel, that land out there was all very vacant. But you can imagine that people still access the beach and the lighthouse by driving out there and parking on the grass where the hotel used to stand. So the access was never limited. When it was the Hotel Macatawa, of course, anybody that stayed at the hotel or came out there for a meal could use the beach or get to the light structure. Now in 64, that's the year when Simon Denial, things were changing for him. And the Park Township, which we all know owns a little sliver on the south side of the channel, Park Township had an opportunity to take over this land and maybe create a public access out there. But instead, they reached out to Simon Denial, who still owned the land, but hadn't done anything with it. And they said, how about you redevelop the Macatawa Park Resort into something else out there? And I think we can all assume that that was to generate better tax revenue than just the vacant land. So in fact, Simon agreed to that. He had a son, Richard Denial. Did anybody know Richard? Yeah, lots of you. So maybe you know more about this than I do, but his son had gone off and started running a hotel in Arizona. Of course, as a kid, he helped his father with the Macatawa Park Hotel. So Simon Denial and Richard developed Point West. So exactly where the hotel stood was this beautiful restaurant facility. And, I guess we'd call it a motel. Did anybody ever stay in the motel? You stayed in the motel. Oh, Mary Claire, you too. You worked in the restaurant. So this is one. Okay, lots of you. I came to Holland in 1995. And so that was just the tail end. I never had a meal out there. So that's my loss. But yeah. And good servers, I understand. Yeah. So for all of you who had this experience, you know much better than I did, but you could go out, have a meal. You might have friends stay in the hotel if you didn't have room in your house. And there was enough parking out there because automobiles had become a fixture in our lives. So you could have a meal and then you could walk down to the beach, maybe, enjoy some time on the beach, walk out to the lighthouse. I suppose people who didn't even have a meal or stay at the hotel could still venture out there. I don't think there was any restrictions to that. So our community had continual access to the beach and the lighthouse for all those years. But in 1970, I wasn't here yet. I came in, as I said, 1995. I'm sure this headline was really disturbing to anybody who had grown up with Big Red as a part of the community. And certainly it was very disturbing to the cottagers, some 150 cottage houses out there that, their cottage park was special because it overlooked this big, beautiful lighthouse. So a number of people, you see all their names on the right, decided to form the Holland Harbor Historical Commission. I wish they'd have chosen a shorter name, but it's quite a long name. They go by the acronym HHLHC. But among the early founders was Willard Wickers. We all know he was the gentleman who brought DeZwaan windmill to Holland, involved with the Holland Museum. So he was a mover and shaker out there. And then we also see Mrs. A. Bondi Gronberg, that's John Gronberg's mother. His father was also involved in this. So many of these individuals own cottages out there. Charles Conrad was also one of the early cottage owners. You might recognize that name. Charles Conrad on the right, he would later preserve the Badger so that it could keep operating. So he was very much preservation minded. And so with the government talking about the lighthouse being superfluous at this point, we could have a post with a light on it and an air horn, and that's what they were trying to evolve into so that they wouldn't have to maintain this big structure. Well, these two individuals thought, how are we going to rally the community? Certainly the Macatawa Park people were behind saving the lighthouse, but how can we get everybody else involved? So they brainstormed, and we know this from oral history, they brainstormed and they said, let's personify the lighthouse. Let's make it seem human because we're more inclined to try to save humans. So they coined the name Big Red as the lighthouse's nickname. So in 1974, the structure had been deteriorating. There was concern about vandalism for the Fresnel lens. That's when it was moved to the Holland Museum, where it still stands. The commission quickly nominated the structure to the National Register of Historic Places. Willard Wickers had a young intern at the museum, and he encouraged her to write this nomination. State of Michigan really wanted to push this through quickly. So that intern, think about it, back in 1978, didn't really have access to all the primary sources that we have today at a click of a button. So we know now that many of the mistakes that made their way onto the historical marker came from this nomination. And I really, the only reason I can say that I was able to find those errors is because of the age of information. So nothing against the intern who did this work. But by 1978, the transferring of the lighthouse to the commission was made official. I think because of headlines like this, I think the community was lulled into believing that the commission purchased from the government the lighthouse. No, in 1978, they did not purchase it. They rented it from the Coast Guard for $1 a year. And rather than erect a light on a pole, the Coast Guard kept the light operational. They put an acrylic lens in it instead of a Fresnel lens and kept it operational, but it would be the job of the renters to maintain that building. If they wanted to have it still stand, they would have to pay the cost for renting it. So the commission began a huge fundraising effort. They still fundraise today. They've got a pot, it generates interest. So it's been an ongoing effort to preserve that building. But what they did soon after taking over as the lessees for this building, they hired Cornerstone Architects to do an assessment of the structure. Is this safe if people want to visit it? And so part of the assessment was also talking about plans for public access, because at that point, we were still able to go out there through the Point West resort out there. So it took from 1978, listed on the National Register, it took until 1987 to erect those markers. And just a little information about the marker program. When you nominate it, the entity who's nominated it pays for whoever is going to do the nomination. In this case, we didn't have to pay the intern. Holland Museum dedicated staff to do that. But you must also pay to erect these signs. So part of the commission's fundraising went into about $3,000 to erect these 2 signs. Don't be deceived into thinking the government pays for these signs. So it's the property owner or the entity preserving these structures. So of course, when you get a historical marker, that brings lots more tourists. Oh, there's a historical structure. Yeah, it's been there for a long time, but it seems new. And then also in 1990, Big Red was selected to be on the cover of the Michigan road map. Do you all remember what a road map is? Isn't this a roadmap? But this was a big deal because this was disseminated all through the Midwest for anybody coming to vacation in Michigan. So that brought lots more people to Holland. And not too long after that, the denials could not keep up the restaurant and the hotel. I don't have any inside knowledge, but so I don't know why this was not a thriving concern, but it had to be demolished in 1995. So we're back to having vacant land out there. However, in 1995, there was a big purchase, and it was J. Van Andel who purchased that land from the denials after the resort was taken down. And we know that the Van Andels on the hill had a cottage. Some of you might have seen it. I didn't see it in person. I've understood that it was a fairly modest cottage for who the Van Andels are. But they nonetheless enjoyed that cottage. It was not built by them. You can see the hill next to them. I understand that he bought the property that was the hill because where do you land your helicopter when you have to get home after work? So that was the helicopter. I keep my helicopter elsewhere, but the all the land in orange, quite a bit of that property was the original Macatawa Park land that the association had sold off to the resort. Certainly everything along Lake Macatawa frontage was, and then the parcels that are on the Lake Michigan side, those had been quietly being purchased by the Van Andels over the year. So by 1995, they owned everything in orange. And we understand that anybody who is coming out there now, you can't have a meal at Point West anymore, but you could still drive out there, except no, 1995, the guardhouse. And so that there were newspaper articles all that summer and into the next year talking about, how come I can't go out there? Why is there a guard turning me away? Well, by then, John Gronberg was involved in the commission. His parents had stepped down, might have passed away by then. And Bill Tasler, who lived out there for a number of years and had helped maintain the lighthouse for the commission, they went to bat. John Gronberg reached out to J. Van Andel and said, how can we work this out? And so you all probably know what was worked out, and it was a very limited access. The Van Andels provided 4 parking spots on their property. You could park there, you could walk out, you couldn't bring a cooler, you couldn't bring a beach umbrella, and you could only stay an hour. So, I commend the Van Andels for making that access available, even though it was very limited. I know it was like a Tuesday, Thursday for out-of-towners. It was different days of the week. You had to really be a genius to figure out when you were allowed to go out there. But people did continue to enjoy access to the lighthouse. And John Gronberg made sure that school children were given the opportunity to go out there. They installed an exhibit inside the lighthouse. They began opening, they had been opening it for tours. They continued to do tours about 3 times a summer, and the Van Andels did allow those tours to continue. But by 2005, there were more newspaper headlines that concerned the community. At this point, the Coast Guard was not interested in owning the building and renting. They wanted to get rid of it altogether. And so our community had another upheaval where we were wondering what's going to happen to our lighthouse. Park Township was considered to be maybe, purchase it. The city of Holland, the state of Michigan, but ultimately it made sense to allow the Historic Commission to purchase the lighthouse and own it outright because they had been taking care of it since the 1970s. So ultimately, after about 3 years, there's our government for you. It took them 3 years to figure out to let it keep operating under the historical commission's ownership. So by 2008, the key was turned over. They were the official owners, and we still had access through the kindness of the Van Andels. But as you know, they both passed away the same year. I believe it was 2004. And David Van Andel took over the property, his son, David Van Andel. And apparently he did not like the small cottage that the Van Andels, their parents didn't have. So I get a kick out of this. I have to say that when you look into the construction of this and you read newspapers, it says that this was a $3.5 million house. I think they forgot a zero. But so now here's the mansion, lovely structure. Nan Van Andel got the property on which the Macatawa Hotel and later Point West stood. She got all that property, and apparently her father had been thinking about a development there. So she started trying to realize her father's dreams and develop what is now Point West condominiums. There was quite a homes. There was quite a bit of bickering with Park Township and the city of Holland and to what would be allowable out there. And ultimately what's built now was finally allowed. But at that point, we had to rely on the generosity of these two individuals to allow continued access. And they did until 2020. What happened in 2020? Pandemic, we were all afraid to be breathing on anybody. And I'm sure that the Van Andels didn't want everybody from the public coming out there and breathing. And who can blame them, really? I mean, we were all very scared for a while, but I understand from John Gromberg, there was also an incident where somebody brought a dog out there. Somebody that was a member of the public didn't have a cottage out there, brought the dog out, and David Van Andel's wife somehow tripped over the dog leash and injured herself. And that was just probably what sealed the deal for them to say, no more access. And that's the way it's been. Now, in recent years, the homeowners who always were able to walk along a boardwalk from the neighborhood across the Van Andels property, they were told no more boardwalk. So if they wanted to access the lighthouse, they had to keep their feet in the wet sand, because that's allowed. But of course, a lot of people are seniors and didn't want to walk on the difficult wet sand. So the light has been off limits to the community as well. So that must have been a tough thing to deal with. But as we look back over the ownership, we see how it started as completely public when it was government land out there and people were just camping wherever they wanted to. And Macatawa Park, limited access. And then the hotel operators, Swan Miller and the Denial family making it public again. And then the Van Andels, going from limited to now private access. Well, John Gronberg owns a cottage out there. He is the head of the Lighthouse Commission, and they are taking steps. They've had a lawsuit to try to acquire access for the cottage owners, hoping that that can parlay into, eventual public access again. But this is tough. I see both sides. I don't want to say anything bad about the Van Andel family. They give us our lighthouse or fireworks every year. They do a lot for the community. My daughter's boyfriend works for the Van Andel Institute, so they're very philanthropic. But of course, we do all, I'm sure, want our access out there. So as we look at where we started with the wooden beacon light to Big Red today, we now understand the greater evolution. I start my book saying Big Red was not always big. It was not always red. It wasn't even always a lighthouse, so we really have to understand that it began, a different way. Well, thankfully, because of the exhibit, because of an article that I wrote for Michigan History Magazine to correct the history, and the book that just came out in August, I think the government, state of Michigan, took a look at all that and felt pretty bad that there were so many errors on this historical marker. So they are in the process of rewriting that. There's going to be a new marker. I've provided the information. I've looked at all the different iterations. Marker text is not taken lightly. I have seen 5 iterations of this marker already, and each time I've tweaked what they've written, and they've been accepting of that. And I think sometime next year we're going to see the new marker. So very happy about that. Thank you. So our landscape out there has changed pretty significantly from back in the day, when it was just vacant land. And you think about Albertus Van Raalte, if he realized that, creating this harbor for public, commercial boat traffic, and look at today, it's primarily recreational traffic out there. But I want to read a passage from the end of the book and say that besides being a navigational aid, as this lighthouse continues to be, it's so much more. Big Red is a teacher who helps us understand the tenacity of our Dutch founders. Big Red is a hero, safely guiding ships into the channel. Big Red is a model, posing for artists. Big Red is a celebrity stalked for photographs and video. Big Red is an influencer promoting the lakeshore. Big Red is a friend who will always meet us down at the beach. And Big Red is a survivor whose existence is credited to a group of selfless first responders. In its many roles, Big Red's legacy reminds us that nothing stays the same. Big Red spent its childhood as a fog signal, its adult life as a lighthouse, and now in its golden years, a beloved community icon. So, thank you. We're doing questions.
What was the original fuel for Big Red and how did it get there?
Kerosene. I don't have any direct knowledge of how it got there, probably by ship, because the lighthouse did frequently deliver supplies, and it started operation before we had the interurban going out there. So I think it would have been a ship delivering it, just like the ships have supplied it, for many, many years. Yes.
Go ahead, Jeannie. Was the channel hand dug?
The original channel. Yeah, there's so much that I wasn't able to convey today, but the original channel was hand dug, wooden supports to, keep the land from collapsing in. But in, I believe it was 1867, the government took over the operation of that. That was after the Civil War. There was more money. There was a lot of repairs being done throughout the country, because of the Civil War. So government took over it. And what you'll see, I tried to play this out in the book. You can see that every time that the government needed to improve the harbor, whether that's dredging, we know dredging has to still happen today, but whenever there was an improvement, the Lighthouse Board tried to piggyback on that and make improvements to the beacon light or the lighthouse later. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. An outstanding presentation. You're to be commended for that. I'm curious to know who or what and when did you develop an interest in lighthouses?
Well, it was really the folks at the Pump House Museum who said, we want an exhibit about this lighthouse. And so, I'd always paid attention to lighthouses because a lot of the shipwrecks that I've studied that have crashed near shore, they say that shore is not the friend of a mariner. If you're stuck in a storm, be offshore because the storm can, create problems. And in Michigan alone, I've created a database from Indiana to the Traverse Bay area that there's about 500 ships that we know trying to get into a channel that grounded near shore. And of course, the lighthouses were developed for that. So, I'm about all things maritime, and I do work for the Michigan Maritime Museum in South Haven, the Port of Ludington Maritime Museum, the Chicago Maritime Museum. But in working for the Pump House Museum, they've challenged me to develop different topics. So I not only did this exhibit, the current exhibit is about the advent of electricity. Well, what do I know about electricity? Well, I know what I know from doing the primary research. You're all learners. You could do the next program on Big Red. I hope you tell people, you start with Big Red wasn't always big, it wasn't always red, and it wasn't always a lighthouse. And then tell them what its real history was. So we can all be, as learners, we can all be educators then. So that's what I've been able to do with my career.
Just as we were moving to Holland about 8-9 years ago, we met a woman, an older woman outside the yellow house down there by the boardwalk.
Okay.
And she said she was the granddaughter of one of the keepers, and this was the house that the keeper had lived
Yes.
in. Do you know
Yes.
anything about that house?
I do. I don't think it made it into my book, but I do know that one of the houses out there was Joseph Boschke's house when he retired. He stayed a contributing member of the community. And Melgert van Regenmoorder's children, I think there were about 7 of them. I tell his whole story. I didn't touch upon it here, but he had 3 different wives. His 2 first wives died, and other wives stepped in as the mothers of the children. And so there's quite a big history out there, but the Boschke's kids and Van Regenmoorder's kids assimilated into that community. I think Van Regenmoorder's kid was a post office master out there. So, it's just been wonderful how they've become a part of the community. Yes? I'm just taking a hand up if I see, okay, well, where the microphone goes. Yeah.
Since I moved here in '98, I've noticed that maybe about 10 years ago, the paint was fading badly. It was known as big pink.
Big pig. Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
then they put a more robust red in.
right. And I understand that was maybe the wrong type of paint. And so it faded more quickly than I anticipated. John Gronberg tells me that it costs about $10,000. And that might be a quote from a while ago, but just $10,000 for the paint job. What he did want me to share with you is that we're going to see some work on the tower. The tower is wood. The lower structure of the lighthouse is steel. And so we're going to see some changes out there. Apparently, when the original tower was built, the windows went outward. I believe I've got this right. They went outward. And so what happens in a big wind is the wind blows these windows open or rattles them. So now when they redo the tower, I don't think they're going to completely rebuild it, but they're going to have windows that open in so that if the wind presses on them, it just tightens their closure. I might have that backward, but we're going to see new windows and work on the tower.
I can just see the people at the National Historic Register looking at their mail and say, oh no, here comes another letter from Valerie VanHeest. But if there were one more thing that you'd like to know about Big Red that you don't know yet, what would it be?
Well, that's a good question. I think electricity, because I'm now very interested in electricity. Why did it take so long when both cottage parks had electric generating plants and we had the interurban coming all the way out there and it needed electricity? Why did it take until 1932 to electrify rectify that. I mean, I didn't want these keepers to lose their job any sooner than they had to, but it would have made sense. So all of you learners, tell me if you learn the answer to that.
I happen to have the
Sorry.
microphone, no offense. I'll
Sorry.
pass it on. Just a simple question. I'm more familiar with the lighthouse in Grand Haven because it's so easy to access.
Mhm.
And I've always wondered about that catwalk thing. What was, you gave me the first clue that I've
Yeah.
ever had about what the purpose was. You want to talk a little bit about those catwalks and the one that's so beautifully preserved at Grand Haven? But
Yep.
I never knew why.
Yep. So Grand Haven and St. Joe have the only two surviving catwalks on this side of Lake Michigan. And they are beautiful. And they were access points for the keeper. We originally had a wooden structure, and there's some pictures you'll see in the book where you'll see some wood because it looks significantly different. But then when they extended the piers and created the arrowheads, that's all evolution of the harbor. But you'll see wood and steel, and then at some point you'll start to see all steel. So it was simply a way he would climb a ladder near shore. He'd have handrails on the top and then could walk along a decked surface on the top of the catwalk. But even then, imagine it's a storm. We've seen those waves and the keeper's holding on and he's walking out there and he's getting hit with water from both sides. I mean, it must have been incredible, but that's how much our government needed these lights to be kept lit to save mariners. And back in the day, you never knew, like, now there was no radio to say, we're coming in, we've got a, 100-ton cargo we're bringing in. They didn't know. So that light had to always be on because you never knew who was coming. And in the case of a storm, any safe harbor, even if the ships weren't headed here, we might become a safe harbor. And once we got our arrowhead breakwater, I think that was when the fog signal building went in. So 1907. So we became a harbor of refuge then, because that arrowhead is meant to protect the ships as they come into the channel. And imagine threading the needle. I had an opportunity to ride a freighter. I was doing a book on self-unloading ships. So I got myself on board a self-unloader, the Maumee. It's since been scrapped. And I rode it from Chicago to Holland. It was an overnight trip. It was about 12 hours. And as we were coming into the channel, it just dawned. I realized our channel is about 150 feet wide. The ship is about 70 feet wide. So this is really threading the needle. And Big Red wasn't big that day. I was looking down at the top of it, and it was Little Red that day. And but what an extraordinary opportunity I had seeing that light shine as I was coming into that channel. So it was a fun trip. Yes.
Two things. Grand Haven, the walkway was to be destroyed by the Coast Guard.
Okay.
But do away with it.
Yep.
My father-in-law was one of the people that saved it.
Saved it.
Yeah,
What was his name?
Vancouvering.
Vancouvering. I recognize
Yeah.
that name. Yeah.
And then number two, wasn't there a hotel out on the north side that burned down?
Yep, that's the Hotel Ottawa originally. Then it became the Ottawa Beach Hotel that had 4 different expansions. If you go down to the beach, Ottawa County erected a kiosk. I did all the curatorial and design for the 4 stages of that hotel. But 1923 is when it burned. And so I think the story on that side, I wrote an article for Michigan History Magazine. That area started out private, but when the railroad was part of developing Ottawa Beach. So when the railroad wanted to get more people out there, that became public. And after the hotel burned, there was talk about that becoming just private again. Nothing would be rebuilt. But there was a judge, this was in multiple cases, and a judge said, no, the community has had access out there since the 1890s, and we're not going to take away that access. So, our two sides are so different in their development. The cottagers at Ottawa Beach, it's kind of a little known truth that Ottawa County owns all the boardwalks that weave through the cottages there. So we, the public, are allowed to walk through there. We're not allowed to walk up to their houses, but we are allowed that access and we're not allowed that, you know, so the different origins of the two sides, you know, really are a challenge. So for anybody on the south side to get to the beach, they have to go to Laketon Park, which is about 4 miles south. I do say in the book, we can still have access and we can take a canoe or a kayak or even a small motorboat, and we can anchor in the wet sand or offshore, and we can walk to the lighthouse that way, but not everybody has a boat. And we could also park and walk 4 miles up from Laketon as long as we keep our feet in the sand. So, you know, and then we can wave at the Van Andels from there. But, you know, we all want easier access than that.
Any other questions? I've had a chance to, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just one more quick question. Why do the foghorns, or why did Big Red's foghorn have 2 tones with the horn?
Well,
I remember that.
yeah, well, it changed when it became an air horn. You know, original fog signal was different, but every fog signal and every light, these are not just lights or sounds, they have codes to them. And so a mariner, if they were caught in a storm and they saw a light, oh, that's a safe harbor. Our light, I believe it flashes 30 on, 30 off. I can't quite remember, but that tells a mariner that that's Holland. And on their navigational charts, you see a little code. So every lighthouse has a different code. And back in the day, when there were many of the wooden structures, many of the steel structures that all looked the same. So the only way to tell they were different is a different light signal or a different sound signal. So.
Valerie, we thank you so much for your presentation today.
Thank you.
I've had a chance to read Valerie's book. I really highly recommend it. It's a very interesting history, and we thank you once again for your presentation. Once again, thank you.
Thank you. I have a few copies here if anybody's interested. $20. Yeah. Yeah.